So we'll continue with looking at how monetary policy works under a variety of shocks. We were looking at the response to a permanent supply shock. When there is no response, potential level of GDP falls, and then over time the aggregate supply curve shifts back because we'll get inflation because workers are no longer as productive as they were before. The idea of productivity being lowered. As we have higher inflation, the Fed will respond by raising the real interest rates automatically along the marginal, the monetary policy curve. And so we end up with lower GDP. And this is basically inevitable if we have a permanent supply shock. With policy, though, we can think about that inevitability. Maybe we can think about hastening that inevitability in the sense of if the Fed pursues contractionary monetary policy right away, then the supply shock, which reduces productivity, would normally over time lead the aggregate supply curve to shift up, and we'd get higher and higher inflation. But if the Fed pursues contractionary monetary policy right away, lowering the MP curve, that's equivalent to shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve. So we have aggregate demand curve shifting left. We end up at our long run new lower level of GDP at potential. And notice now inflation has not risen, rather actually inflation in this scenario has declined somewhat moderately from pi 1 to pi 2. So by pursuing a contractionary monetary policy, we're not going to be able to stabilize the unemployment effects of this productivity shock, this permanent productivity shock, but we can stabilize the price effects of it and not have inflation. So again, divine coincidence, the central bank tool of pursuing contractionary monetary policy in this case can alleviate the negative effects of this shock. Let's go to a temporary supply shock, though, and here we represent a temporary supply shock, such as a price shock. Remember, our aggregate supply curve is given by pi equals pi minus 1 plus gamma y minus yp plus some sigma price shock. And so we can imagine a price shock happening. A negative price shock shifts the aggregate supply curve upwards. So GDP falls, and if we do nothing, we get unemployment and inflation. Over time, the inflation rate will come back down because GDP is below potential, and so we'll gradually shift back. So we have a reduction in GDP, and then over time an increase in GDP. So we get initial inflation, so we have inflation and unemployment. So that's typically what we call stagflation. So we have both inflation and unemployment over time. Can policy do any better? Well, let's go back to our scenario. The aggregate supply curve is shifted to the left, and now, unfortunately, there's no divine coincidence. We can stabilize either employment or prices, but not both. And to see that, we consider the two kinds of policies that the monetary authorities could take. They could increase pursue an expansionary monetary policy. I'm sorry, this is contractionary monetary policy by raising the MP curve. So they pursue a contractionary monetary policy that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. So we have the economy going further negative in terms of GDP, but notice now we're at price stability, so prices haven't changed, inflation hasn't changed, and now over time the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left and till we're eventually back at potential. So we have a deep recession, GDP is going down, unemployment's going up, but we never get inflation higher than our initial target level of inflation. So that's one possibility that the central bank could pursue. The other possibility is following our initial shock is the central bank could pursue expansionary monetary policy, which we represent by a shift down of the monetary policy curve. So an expansionary monetary policy aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So notice now our new equilibrium is here. GDP stays the same, but we get a much higher increase in inflation. So inflation goes from pi 1 all the way up to pi 2. So we get a lot of inflation, but no decrease in unemployment. So there's a trade-off. Expansionary monetary policy generates an increase in inflation, but no change in GDP. Contractionary monetary policy generates no change in inflation, but a large decrease in GDP. So we don't have the divine coincidence anymore. Instead, we have a conundrum about what the central bank should do. Should the central bank care more about short-term employment effects, or should the central bank care more about inflation effects?